So thank you very much. My name is Petar Jandric. I'm chair for this session. Welcome to the International Symposium on Democracy, Global Citizenship and Transformative Education, New Perspectives to Understand, Engage and Act Together. Today's session is gonna be, have two speakers. It will be a roundtable discussion on the meaning of education, citizenship. So some questions covered will be: how does identity factor into what we do, what we know, and what we should change in education? How does the pandemic, the political, economical context, and educational research inform our thinking on trends, issues, and concerns in education? How should we reconsider citizenship within a sea of social inequalities? And the discussion will hopefully touch on these questions and issues and many others. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Lynette Shultz is professor and director of the Center for Global Citizenship Education and Research at the University of Alberta, as well as co-editor of the journal Contemporary Issues in Education. She has published widely on the topics of education policy, democracy, social justice, and global citizenship, with a particular focus on the geopolitics of knowledge. Handel Wright has been variously Canada Research Chair of Comparative Cultural Studies, David Lam Chair of Multicultural Education, and co-editor of the journal International Education and editorial board member of Cultural Studies. He's currently professor and director of the Center of Culture, Identity and Education at the UBC. He is also senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Handel has published extensively on continental African cultural studies of education, critical multiculturalism, anti-racist education, qualitative research, and post-reconceptualization curriculum theorizing. I wish a warm welcome to our guests, and I guess that we should start with somebody. Lynette, perhaps?
Okay. So how Handel and I discussed our time together is that we'll kind of move back and forth. Because this is a round table, there is an expectation that people will ask questions and that we have quite a bit of time for discussion. So I'm going to just start with a bit about Canada and citizenship. So I must first declare it was a bit tricky being given the topic of education and citizenship and having 10 to 15 minutes to talk about it. Really such a massive topic, and in a conversation that has people from outside of Canada. So I'm going to do a little bit of work to frame understandings of citizenship and some of the history of citizenship in Canada and how that impacts the kind of work that we're doing around citizenship and education. So I don't know how many people are from Canada, how many people are from outside, but I'll just do a quick recap. So Canada's history and Canada's citizenship history rests on being a white settler colony. So the legal framework, so we're talking about the creation of what was called a nation, the legal framing of citizenship was always in the service of developing Canada as a colony filled with white settlers. And what that did and continues to do is mask very important aspects of belonging and exclusion on this land. So of course, the most significant and first one of those exclusions is the recognition of Indigenous people and the rights to land and the rights to sovereignty. And so the original citizenship, although in defining this place as a colony, there were treaties that were established that were agreements between equals about how this kind of sharing land might take place. It was, of course, a long history of those treaties being denied and certainly citizenship was very different for Indigenous people than it was for people who were of European descent and came as settlers into the colony. And so, so that's one of our huge issues that continues to impact how we understand citizenship right now in Canada. And I'll come back to that in a minute. A second one is that the setting up and the establishing policy and laws around this notion of being a white settler colony masked the great diversity of people that were here and that came to live in Canada. So they created permanent categories of minority that continue to be enacted today in our relations, so that anyone who wasn't from this privileged category would be excluded and had a differentiated kind of citizenship. And early on, so as people arrived, the policies would recognize the only particular citizens. In a 1919 Handbook for New Canadians, it stated, and I'll quote, "The good citizen," so this is a handbook about Canada for New Canadians, "A good citizen loves God, loves the Empire, loves Canada, loves his own family, and is every inch a man." So that says pretty clearly about who was imagined as a citizen in this country of Canada. And really, there's just so many, we could spend 20 days just going through all of the issues around citizenship that are within that short description. But I really want to focus first about the idea of being a colony and the relations with Indigenous people here. And so at the core of all notions of citizenship here is this this process, the colonial process of dehumanizing and often a kind of a genocidal approach to others. We certainly have that history. We have a long history of trying to contain and destroy knowledge systems that existed across this land originally, and being replaced with a European knowledge system that was then used as legitimate policy knowledge and certainly part of that colonial structure that was put in place. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of that. So what happened? What happens because we have this colonial past that we have really avoided until recently? And I'll just pause for a second and acknowledge absolutely tremendous and powerful research and activism that is being done by Indigenous people across the land to identify those colonial structures, to overturn them, to in fact, in many ways, act outside of those colonial structures and the notion of citizenship that has been laid upon Indigenous people. So, I just want to make sure that it's clear that there's a lot of work now being done by Indigenous people to push against this. But what we see in education and in our relations, again, a colonial kind of mindset that creates hierarchies of knowledge, right? Where a particular European knowledge is seen as knowledge, and all other knowledges and experiences of life worldviews are seen as somewhat peripheral, right? They're diminished. So where Western knowledge is seen as science and as legitimate, where other kinds of knowledge would be seen as certainly deficient in some. And so what emerged out of that, of course, is a kind of braiding together of this dominating sense of racism, so that knowledge systems are put into a hierarchy. Certainly bodies are put into a hierarchy. Patriarchy and imperialism. So these were all in a colonial worldview. These things are braided together. And that's certainly been the case in the Canadian, in Canada, and enacted through policies of citizenship. So I need to close fairly quickly here. The decolonial, so what we're seeing is a move and a move to decolonize the knowledge systems, to identify the way that colonialism is entangled in our relations and in our understandings of the rights of citizens across Canada. And we see certainly in our case, we see lots of a growing support for anti-racism social movements, as I noted, Indigenous rights. It's interesting, certainly within my experience as a professor teaching in Alberta, in Edmonton, Alberta, we see a tremendous interest and knowledge in students around a decolonial thinking, around anti-racism, and so on. And so I think that there's we see a movement that can begin to address some of the structures that have been so firmly put in place. I'm going to pass it over to Handel to do to talk a bit, and then a little bit later I'll talk a little more about the work that we are doing at the Center for Global Citizenship, Education and Research, and so a more local sense of how this is all connected into education. So Handel, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks so much, Lynette. So Lynette's given a kind of really, I hope, very hopeful take on that history of education and of citizenship. And my role I see somewhat differently. So I'm going to go over similar ground, but differently, because my emphasis is more on identity. So I want to talk about identity and an aspect of citizenship that is implied in citizenship, about belonging. So I want to give you another take on Canada. Canadians in the audience will recognize themselves in this, because every country has what you might call an image text, right? Which is the story that it tells everybody about itself, right? So who we are, who the nation is, how we think about the nation. So our identity is wrapped up in the national image text, which is the story we tell the world, and the story we tell ourselves about the characteristics and the character of Canada. And so what is Canadian identity? So the Canadian national image text is one that both Canadians and non-Canadians will be familiar with. Canada is a very tolerant nation. Canada is very welcoming. Canada celebrates diversity. Canada, in fact, has multiculturalism ingrained into it. So those are the ideas that we pass on to the world, and those are the ideas that we tell ourselves about who we are and what it means to be Canadian. And we now, of course, there are lots of people who really celebrate and defend Canadian multiculturalism. This is part of our character. Gloria Grostein said it's a part of the very fabric of Canadian identity. And Charles Taylor speaks, of course, strongly about a politics of recognition. So even if you feel that there are groups that don't necessarily have that strong sense of belonging, there's a politics of recognition to help the rest of Canada ensure that all groups are represented. This is a very wonderful image, of course. So if you recognize it, good. So how true is that image? Well, there are things that kind of shake that image up a little bit. There's the little matter of Quebec and the fact that Quebec doesn't subscribe to multiculturalism, but rather has a separate policy, a policy of interculturalism. So some people would like to smooth over those differences by saying, well, interculturalism is just sort of like another form of multiculturalism. But actually, Quebec and interculturalism really do serve to disrupt Canada's image text. So there are things like you have to make, I don't know if there are concessions or whatever, like the idea of Quebec being a distinct society. That has to be acknowledged officially, right? So belonging in Quebec means belonging in a distinct society. So this is not just about language and culture, which is what some people reduce it to. So the French language and a Quebecois culture. What is often not spoken about is that this is also a result of a history of discrimination against the French by the other dominant group, the English, because Lynette mentioned those three groups. The three founding groups are supposed to be the English, the French, and the indigenous peoples. But we then go on to talk about the great solitude, the two solitudes of English and French. See how that automatically then erases indigeneity, but I'll come to indigeneity a little bit later. So what people don't talk about in that idea of who we are as Canadians, this Canadian identity, this Quebec exceptionalism, is that whole Je me souviens. Je me souviens is also about that history of discrimination against the French. We don't talk enough about the Quiet Revolution, right? So we need to see interculturalism as a rejection of multiculturalism, rather than multiculturalism by another name. So to be Francophone, to be Quebecois, is for some to stand apart from, if not in opposition to Canada and Canada's national text, Canada's image text. So we begin to see fractures in this rosy picture that I started off with, if you consider Quebec and interculturalism. We also need to consider indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples, many of them reject both multiculturalism and interculturalism. And they do so because of the irony of how indigeneity is placed or recognized within both of them. So the Quebec would reject multiculturalism because it renders Quebec only one more part of a mosaic of cultures, right? And the irony of multiculturalism and interculturalism is that this is not the hand extended by indigenous peoples. So we have people who are not indigenous, who have arrived somewhere, turning around and saying to the world, we welcome everybody, even as you've now occupied somebody else's land. So part of the way that we need to educate ourselves is about these discourses, these competing discourses, not just juxtaposed discourses of multiculturalism, interculturalism, and indigeneity. So much of the world speaks to post-colonialism, rightly. I'm from a post-colonial state, Sierra Leone. We gained our independence in 1961, so we can talk in that sense about a kind of nationalism that's based on the post-colonial. And Canada supposedly is independent, but proudly bears the vestiges of colonialism. We have a governor general, we have lieutenant governor generals, we have the queen as a titular head of state, et cetera, which are all, for some people, just really curiosities, but they have really strong implications for indigenous peoples and the idea of indigenous sovereignty. So in North America and some other locations marked by colonialism of occupation, including Canada, this is still a colonial moment. So the importance then is not so much one of addressing post-colonial Canada, but addressing Canada, as Lynette put it, this is about settler colonialism, addressing Canada as still colonized space, and therefore the importance of decolonialism. So when we talk about education, then we need to talk about how these various discourses play, how that dominant discourse of that image text and multiculturalism and tolerance is projected onto the world and projected onto us. But on the other hand, how Quebec and interculturalism disrupts that narrative and begins to raise questions. But Quebec, of course, has its own problems, and how indigeneity plays a role in that. And we need to have a way of educating ourselves about citizenship that begins to not answer these as this is the answer or that is the answer, but to get at how fraught all of this is and how messy the idea of citizenship is once you move it out of nominal citizenship and begin to look at cultural citizenship. So I'll kind of stop there, and maybe I don't see any questions yet for Lynette or myself, but I'll pass it on to Lynette again to take things up further.
So I wanted to thanks, Handel, and I'm glad that you saw what I said as positive, because I often don't feel that. We have a massive tangling of these histories, and often we try to teach them as factual history rather than as a kind of building a historical consciousness, understanding how the legacies, the events, the relations that were put in place in that creation of this settler colony have continued. And so I think it's that wrong sense of and limited sense of how we teach that Canadian history that prevents so much of the understanding of how it is that colonialism is so dominant in our policies and in deciding what is legitimate policy knowledge when it comes to citizenship, who gets included and who isn't, and that the durability of racism, the durability of the exclusion of Indigenous people and the refusal to acknowledge and live by the treaties that we have been committed to, right? We were committed in the signing of those as people who've come here. So I think that there's a really important shift in how we teach that history. And I think what you've said, Handel, is exactly right. That complexity of these relations and how we go forward. So I feel very often frustrated that teachers very often, and pre-service teachers in their training, are often taught to be afraid of taking on controversial issues. And citizenship in Canada and examining that colonial history is certainly, is a huge controversy in a classroom. You know, we see right now in Alberta, I'm going to talk a little bit about very localized things, that the rise of white supremacy is, I guess I would like to say it's surprising, but it's not, but it is certainly becoming bolder. And I know that there's impacts from our southern neighbors where movements of white supremacy have been legitimized, but certainly, you know, research from the Center for Prevention of Violence, some of the research and the reporting from that center shows that we really need to address that white supremacy and how it can be exist and accelerated at the context right now. So some of the things that we're doing, I'll talk just a bit about what we're doing at the Center for Global Citizenship and the work that we're doing. And so this is we work really in a multi-scalar way. So we're, you know, and over the years, in the 20 years that we have been working, shifting very much to a decolonizing framework, and where that takes us, where that lands us in terms of knowledge, pedagogy, positioning ourselves and understanding the structures that we're in. You know, we really work to change the relations, and to help to contribute to doing education very differently so that citizenship can be changed. I think these things, you know, thinking about the process of change in education is really important. What is it that we teach? How do we teach? And what are the kinds of impacts that can have? You know, I've done my share of standing and yelling in it and describing what's going on. I guess I'm just getting older, and I just really want to bring that into changing the kinds of relations that are possible in the communities. And so we do, in many ways, and certainly at the University of Alberta, we have had a very strong guidance and impact by Indigenous scholars in the Faculty of Education. Some absolutely, you know, some of Canada's best scholars are working very hard here. And, you know, if we listen and begin to shift our understandings of, you know, how do we make our way out of these colonial relations? How do we push against these structures? There is really, where we've landed is actually also looking at planetary citizenship. So it's kind of like, in order to understand the local, we go to the planetary and come back. We need a kind of whole view to be able to see that things could be different. There are different ways of being in relation. Achille Mbembe gave a lecture recently where he talked about planetary citizenship. Actually, he talked about how we're waging a war against the planet. That is, in fact, the same war that we have waged as a colonial project, right? And so in many ways, by linking the treatment of the planet, the treatment of non-human and human, bringing that together into understanding citizenship differently, it begins to rattle the base of some of these structures. And so I find right now, in terms of citizenship in Canada and citizenship education, that one of the ways that we can address the core I guess the feet, the legs, the foundation of some of these structures is to begin to take the planet, this place that we're on, the land that we're on, these relations very seriously. As Mbembe talks about, he said, all societies that lasted for millennia had deep ethical knowledge about hospitality. He talked about how our interconnections among all life on the planet sustained societies for millennia. So these are parts of the knowledge that was, that have been excluded through colonial kinds of education. But he, Mbembe talked more about, hospitality as a kind of responsibility that we have when we encounter others. And he talked about that, hospitality sets up a host and a carer, a hostee, a host and a hostee. But really, the place where we meet is the ultimate host. And he said, we face a future where our planet is not hospitable. It reflects our relations to each other, that it becomes inhospitable. And so I guess I would propose, where my work is landing is that these deep changes can come from that place. And I agree, Mbembe talked also in that same lecture about what he called planetary citizenship. The foundation of decolonial work has to begin with anti-racism, right? It begins at that level. That's where work needs to start. So I'll just offer those up as pieces of work that are emerging right now and I think that they will help us understand how to address the great problems we have in this differentiated citizenship that we have created in Canada, the inequality and yeah. So I'll hand it back to you, Handel.
Thanks so much, Lynette, for that. You've taken us into the problem and then into the possibility of decolonial thought as part of the solution. I'd like to maybe follow in your footsteps, but again, maybe do it a little bit differently. So I'll do some of the same. I'll start with settler colonialism and the problems of its effects. It's pretty straightforward when we're dealing with whiteness to talk about how problematic settler colonialism is. But I want to get at how complicated things can be. Because when people have been writing history, for example, others have been written out of history. So it was possible, for example, locally here in British Columbia for somebody to, I think the Sun here had a whole spread on the history of British Columbia, and Black British Columbia was almost completely erased. But putting people back into history is not such a simple exercise. So if you take Black people, for example, how are we to be located in relationship to the notion of settler colonialism? Can Black people, oppressed as they are, also be settler colonizers, right? So if you think of how people have been excluded in Nova Scotia, for example, Black people are very quick to claim a kind of settler identity, to say because the more recently you arrive in Canada, the less Canadian you are. So people are eager to show a history, a long history, but that history then makes you become part of the problem of the colonizing mission. In British Columbia, it's the same. People want to say, oh, it's not just recent refugees from Africa, there are very few Black people. Black people have been here for the longest time. Black people came here from the US, from San Francisco. They were the first settlers of Salt Spring Island. Well, what's the politics of that, of being those first settlers? So you begin to see that the moment you want to correct history, you might be creating other problems in history. So we have to take take up this messiness and begin to see how we can address it. And decoloniality is one of the solutions. I like that you went there and that you drew on Mbembe. And that made me think of a tension maybe between Mbembe's approach to decoloniality and, say, Walter Minolio's approach to decoloniality. So Minolio would say, for example, we have to go back to those, we have to reject this, so we have to find another way, reject everything that exists right now and find, so decolonialism means a rejection of this received white racist idea. And just, it's almost like a starting afresh. Mbembe's idea is to continue to pick at it. Say, it's not just about rejecting it, we have to examine it because we can't move from it if we don't address it. So Minolio is a turning away from, and Mbembe is a constant engagement with in order to move. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying that those are two different kinds of approaches to what we might do in terms of decolonial thought in the kind of work that we might want to produce, because these things are so very, very complicated. And the place of others complicates, you know, that neat dualism that people might want to create between colonizer and colonized. So and I pointed to Black people in Canada as one example to say, well, how do we get at that complicated way of taking up things where it's not just, well, colonizer bad, indigenous good, and therefore if you take up the indigenous, you have arrived at a solution. So what is that complicated way in which we also can see and take note of the complexities of how different peoples have arrived in this place that we call Canada, and what it means to engage them, what kind of education is possible, what kinds of ways of dealing with history is possible. I was just at an event by the Ethiopian writer, Maza Mengiste, and she does really beautiful work. Her novels are historical, but they're about stories. So, and indigenous people know all about stories and the use and the power of stories. So how do we go beyond simply contesting history with a capital H in the way that we want to think about identity and belonging in Canada, and begin to have histories with small h, various history. And much of her work also deals with bringing up stories of women and what women did in this anti-colonial struggle in Ethiopia. And those histories have been erased. Those stories have been erased. So how do we get stories to speak to histories? How do we legitimate stories and her stories as versions of history and things that stand beside history and contest history even? So we need to develop and legitimize other ways of knowing in the way that we begin to talk about knowledge formation, and about what constitutes the truth, because we're not arriving at truth with a capital T, but various truths, various versions of truth that begin to get us to understand what it means to be an Albertan, a British Columbian, a Canadian, or let alone a citizen of the world. So those are things that occur to me as, you know, how we might begin to think about education somewhat differently, a lot differently. Part of it being legitimating other ways of knowing, other stories, addressing history from multiple positions, seeing that there's more than history that makes the truth of our past and who we are. So with that as another kind of statement, I'll pass it on to you again.
Can we perhaps at some point address questions from the chat?
Yeah,
Sure,
I was
let's
just going
begin to get to those. Yeah.
Maybe, maybe
Actually-
Lynette, if you just finish your, and then we can, after you.
Well, actually, what I was going to say actually addresses a little bit Michael's question about the resilient diasporic cultures in some of the cities as cultures of resistance, and how, you know, this idea of being absorbed into national image text. And so I've been really interested in terms of you know, rising nationalism, and the rise of the right, and so a political analysis of nationalism lately. And so that, you know, is impacts European countries and certainly within North America. And I was interested in the work of Sarah Ferris, and she writes about, I think her book is titled "In the Name of Women's Rights: The Rise of Femonationalism," and she has identified how sort of liberal multiculturalism, liberal feminism, liberalism, notions of liberal democracy have been turned toward and being kind of co-opted into nationalist movements in ways that serve to serve a profound agenda of racism. Her example in her book is around racism against Muslims and Arabs, and how the agenda of women's rights and gender equality taken up, and it's certainly the Canadian government speaks widely and promotes the idea of gender equality in all kinds of international policies and local policies, but how that agenda itself is taken up to support a rising nationalism that will serve to exclude and to create, you know, again, it creates both white supremacy, it creates the de-citizenizing of significant populations. So I think that we need to be very thoughtful when we're looking at how some of these movements, what we're seeing, the shifts that we're seeing now in terms of nationalism and the you know, social movements, that, you know, we can really pick up some of these ideas and they get turned. And so we need to be very thoughtful about how we're understanding what's actually going on in some of these movements.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lynette, and thanks for your question, Michael. I was thinking of Tanya's question, but I think it might, I'm still getting Michael's question and Lynette's response in my head, so I'd like to speak to Michael's question also. I think my answer to that would be a yes and a no, because you're quite right that some people have said, for example, that in big cities, some big cities are now not only multicultural, but are distinctly diasporic. So we have cultures, identities that are now sort of transnational, that have taken root in a very, very strong way. So there are entire neighborhoods, there are ethnoburbs. For example, where I live in Richmond, and that is very much a kind of a Chinese ethnoburb. And if you go to Surrey, you're dealing with a South Asian ethnoburb. So yeah, you're right. So those, they've become diasporic spaces, more, even more than they are. They're still multicultural spaces, but they're also now diasporic spaces. And in some ways, that makes them spaces of resistance, but there are spaces of resistance in both good and bad ways. So there are spaces of resistance in some ways that they give the lie to the notion of a kind of Canadian multiculturalism and general mixing, et cetera, which everybody thinks is wonderful. But if you're living in Vancouver and you're Black and you realize there's basically no Black ethnoburbs, you know that that forced mixing, the idea that there are no Black spaces, has a very detrimental effect. So this idea of all of us mixing, which Angela Merkel said famously in Germany will not work, right? That's one thing. So in that sense, maybe there's something good about that. But I would also note that what very often happens in some of those diasporic cultures and ethnoburbs is a reassertion and an overemphasis on the traditional from those cultures, a kind of romanticization of sometimes very problematic traditional ways, for example, of being South Asian, of what it means to be Nigerian, or what it means to be Chinese. So these things become spaces of resistance to change, and that sometimes can be very detrimental for some members of those societies. So how much freedom would women have or girls have in those kinds of societies? How much acknowledgement of the validity of, say, queer identities in some of those spaces? So there's opportunities for positive resistance, but there's also opportunities for a kind of solidification of traditionalism that can be really problematic. So it's not about all being absorbed into the national image text, because even the national image text itself is shaky. So what some of those spaces do is they allow people, for example, because of how fast we can now move, to say now move back and forth between Hong Kong and Vancouver, where people's identities are no longer that fixed as being Canadian or as being quote unquote Chinese or from Hong Kong, such that new kinds of identities are emerging that are not fixed, that the kind of citizenship that Lynette was saying that we talk about and preach, whatever, those people kind of elide those ideas of belonging because they don't belong in one space. And people are becoming increasingly comfortable with not belonging in that strong cultural sense. So I have maybe more faith and hope in those people who are not settled in that way, who have those multiple identifications of citizenship, even more than the diasporic cultures in and of themselves as the spaces of resistance. I consider those malleable, non-pin-downable identities as being the real spaces for progressive transformation.
Can I want to just ask you a question about that, Handel. I wonder about, I mean, it really is a small elite that travel in that way, that have, and so in some ways, the liberalism of being elite, an economic elite, is attractive. But in many ways, to what degree I guess it's difficult to see places where progressive policies come out of that kind of location within society. Kind of the liberal freedom to move about and to is certainly held as really important. But some of the other kinds of progressive policies about, again, I'm thinking of citizenship kind of policy work, really are not taken up by that group, the kind of elite members of both the diaspora and of long-term Canadian who feel, have one citizenship, one sense of citizenship identity. I don't know. Do you see cases of that?
Well, what I was trying to speak to is the potential, because you're quite right, and because now we're getting into the discourse of cosmopolitanism in a way. I didn't name it, but that's where we're headed. So this is about cosmopolitanism, and you're right. The people who can literally afford to travel all over the world are kind of elite. So that's one of the problematic aspects of what we might call a kind of cosmopolitan disposition. And some of those people don't want to be tied down to, to countries or nations and become citizens, for example, only of the US. If you're spending part of your time in South Africa, then you're in Jordan, then you're in Mexico, then you are, then you are in Malaysia, right? And you're moving around like that. And sometimes it's out of a corporate existence or something, you're head of a company. So yeah, a lot of those people are not interested in progressive change per se, right? So there is that elitist aspect to this, but the cosmopolitan thing is also operating even without physical travel. So you can have people in Sierra Leone who know how to do the latest Nene dance coming out of Atlanta, even before some youth in Vancouver learn about it, because they've seen it on the news. You can get it on YouTube. You can, so there are ways in which technology makes not even just identities, but the identifications, especially with youth culture, et cetera, very much global, even more global than it's ever been. And I'm just saying somewhere in there's a kernel of possibility for us to change. Now, I'm not giving you concrete examples to say this is how this has changed, but there are examples of how some of this have become global movements like climate change and Greta Thunberg, in one country and somebody else in South Africa becomes a global movement that transcends national boundaries. And that's because many of those youth have freed themselves of this idea of belonging within the nation only. Whilst in fact, nationalism, I want to point to those kinds of possibilities than what, for example, is being done around the global pandemic and the adherence to nationalism and what that then looks like. Because look at what has been done in the name of not only nationalism, but a kind of neo-colonial mentality of the West versus the rest and the nation first, where Western nations are hoarding millions and millions of doses of vaccines while people are suffering in other places in the name of, well, it's center versus periphery. We take care of ourselves first and we think of the nation and our citizens first before the rest of the world. And the virus doesn't know about your, center periphery thinking, doesn't care about your ideas of your Western superiority. It's gonna go sit somewhere in Namibia and mutate. It's gonna sit somewhere in Peru and mutate, and it's gonna come back with a vengeance that will make nonsense of all this kind of nationalistic ways of thinking. So we've got to educate ourselves about how connected we all are in the globe and really take global citizenship seriously.
Thank you very much. We are 5 minutes before the end of the session. So maybe if you could just, perhaps, if you could first see whether there are any questions from the audience.
Sure, happy to take some questions.
Comments, whatever. Okay.
Io has a hand up, so I believe.
Does she?
I'm
Okay.
just,
Yeah, please
hi.
go ahead.
Sorry. Great. So thought-provoking. Thank you so much for all of these. Just very, just my mind is abuzz. But so I thought one question I had was how maybe we might balance these sort of like need for global perspectives with highly local context, which also serves as a process of decolonization, of paying attention to these sort of the particularities of a community and a land and a situated context, and maybe how, maybe you could speak to how to balance those issues.
So my understanding of global, so I mean, it really depends where you land when you think of global, because in many ways, when we talk about global, it really reflects thinking about globalized, economic globalization, the kind of this idea that there's a culture and an existence that isn't located somewhere. And so that's why I use instead the notion, or link that with the idea of planetary. So if we look at, planetary citizenship, that this interconnection, that we exist and are interconnected on a shared planet, it gives us a perspective that we can then see reflected back in our local context. Sometimes I guess it is the old fish in water, right? Until you look at your local context a little bit differently, things like structural inequalities can be, we swim in them and we don't see them. So there's a global perspective, can help us see colonialism in a different way. It can help us see neoliberal economics in a different way, etc. So my sense is that absolutely these things are connected. Bruno Latour said there's no such thing as the global. There's only a whole collection of locals. And when we begin to see that, then we can understand our place, what is happening in our place is part of a whole. And that if we want to change what's happening there, we can work at this multi-scalar level. You want to finish up, Handel? 1 minute?
No, I don't have much to add to that. I think you're quite right. And that relationship between the local and the global, the local and the planetary, I think, does remind us to speak in terms of the planet that we're living on and our relationship with the planet. And we really, whether it's going back to indigenous thought from around the world, various indigenous peoples, or even our own need to shift away, because even sometimes it's religion that's responsible for some of this. We have to think of ourselves relationally, in relationship to other species, in relationship to the rest of the planet. And capitalism hasn't helped, right? The idea of just producing, it's not making a lot of sense, but we keep doing it. Living more consciously, thinking about our relationship to the planet, they all sound like, really outmoded ideas, but that's the way we have to do our education, I think, is to think very differently about who we are and not be so anthropocentric.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for this great session. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.